Theodore Raymond Voss was 38 years old the morning he signed the final acquisition documents for a company he had been watching for 14 months. And the woman whose name was on the building had no idea she had sold it to the man she told to his face, 6 years prior, that he would never amount to anything. He drove a 10-year-old Chevy Silverado that had seen better quarters, and wore a canvas jacket that had been washed so many times the color had migrated towards something between gray and nothing. His former colleagues at the firm where he had once been passed over for promotion called him Dependable Theodore, and did not mean it the way he preferred. He was a civil engineer by training, a logistics consultant by employment, and a builder of things by inclination. The kind of man who looked at a broken system and could not stop himself from seeing how it was supposed to work. Her friends had called him a dreamer, and she had let them, and then one Thursday evening in February she had said the words directly, clearly, without cruelty, but without softness either. The way you say a thing you have been thinking for a long time, and have finally decided to stop protecting someone from. She had moved out the following weekend. She had taken the joint furniture and the second car and the sense of the apartment as a place someone lived rather than a place someone kept coming back to. What Camille Voss did not know was that the man she had said those words to had never once forgotten them and had never once allowed them to be true. She had called the main office line 7 times in the 48 hours after the acquisition announcement appeared in the Nashville Business Chronicle. Not one of those calls had been returned. What happened when they finally sat across a table would close the only account that had ever mattered to him. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The October morning smelled of damp leaves and the particular stillness of a city not yet fully awake. And Theodore Voss sat at the desk in the spare bedroom of the house on Caldwell Street that he had bought 3 years ago and renovated every weekend since. And he looked at the acquisition summary the way he looked at every completed project. Not with pride exactly, but with the flat and functional satisfaction of a man who had built a thing and confirmed it was level. The desk itself was one he had made from a reclaimed oak door he had found being disposed of during a commercial renovation he had consulted on 2 years prior. He had seen it leaning against a dumpster and had loaded it into the truck bed and brought it home and cut and refinished it over 4 evenings, fitting new legs from square steel stock he threaded and welded himself in the garage. It was not a beautiful desk in the way of things made to impress. It was a sound desk. It did not wobble. Everything that mattered fit on it. His father, Lawrence Voss, had been a civil engineer before him, a roadman who spent 30 years designing and inspecting the infrastructure that other people used without thinking about, and who had told Theodore when he was 11 years old, watching him try and fail and try again to level a bookshelf he was building in the basement, "Son, the most important measurement you will ever take is the first one. Get the first measurement right, and everything that follows has a chance. Rush the first measurement, and you spend the rest of the project paying for it." Lawrence had been gone 8 years. Theodore measured twice before every cut, and had never once consciously thought about why. The holding entity, Voss Capital Group, LLC, had been registered in Delaware 4 years ago. Seated with the savings Theodore had accumulated through 2 years of working a second consulting contract he had taken on without fanfare and without discussing with anyone who did not need to know. He was not a secretive man by nature. He was a precise one. He had learned, through the specific education of watching people dismiss what they did not understand, that announcing a thing before it was built invited interference from people who preferred things to stay as they were. And he had decided that he owed no one a preview of what he was constructing. The company he had acquired was called Meridian Systems, a mid-sized logistics software firm headquartered in an office park in Brentwood, Tennessee, that Camille had co-founded 8 years ago with a partner named Stuart Ashby, and had since bought out. becoming the sole owner of a business that billed itself as a supply chain optimization platform for regional distributors, and that had, in Theodore's assessment, a genuinely valuable product being delivered through an operationally chaotic infrastructure that was suppressing its margins and limiting its growth, and that could be fixed by someone who understood both the engineering side and the logistics side simultaneously. He was the only person he knew who understood both sides simultaneously. He had also, in the 2 years before the acquisition, become the firm's largest outside customer through a consulting arrangement his own clients had been directed to adopt. A decision that had been made purely on product merit, and that had the secondary effect of giving him 14 months of intimate operational visibility into Meridian's back end before he made an offer. Camille had never connected the consulting client to her former husband. The client entity had a name that meant nothing to her. She had not asked about the ownership structure. Most people did not. He had met Camille at an engineering firm in Nashville 9 years ago, when she was in business development and he was a mid-level project engineer, and neither of them had yet become who they were going to become. She had been direct and driven, and had a quality he had responded to powerfully, an absolute confidence in her own direction, a certainty about where she was going and how she was going to get there. He had found that magnetic before he had found it suffocating. There had been a season early in the marriage when she had talked about what they were going to build together, and he had believed her, because she said it with the conviction of a person who had already seen the destination and was simply reporting back. The difficulty, which he had not fully understood until later, was that her vision of the destination had always featured her at the center of it, and him as infrastructure. The February evening had arrived at the end of a year in which he had been passed over for partner at the consulting firm where he worked, had started his second contract in silence, and had told Camille too carefully, too precisely, in the way of a man laying out a structural proposal rather than a dream about a business he wanted to build. She had listened. She had asked 3 questions. Then she had said the words, "You will never amount to anything." Not shouted, not thrown. Delivered flatly in the kitchen, with her coat still on from work, as if she were reading the conclusion from a report she had already finished. He had not argued. He had not defended. He had gone to the bedroom and stood at the window for 20 minutes, and then come back to the kitchen and said he thought they had reached the end of something, and she had agreed, and that had been that. He had written the words down on an index card that evening. He had taped it to the inside cover of the notebook where he kept his project notes. Not to nurse grievance, to maintain clarity about what was true and what had simply been said by someone who was wrong. She moved out. He stayed in the apartment until the lease was up, and then moved to Caldwell Street and bought the house and started building. The second consulting contract had been signed the week before Camille said the words, in a quiet meeting with a regional distribution company that needed a logistics infrastructure assessment, and had found Theodore through a referral. He had disclosed it to no one. It had felt, at the time, simply like additional work. In the months after February, it had become something more specific, the foundation of a plan that had not yet fully articulated itself, but that was accumulating the resources a plan required. He had taken on a 3rd contract in the summer, a 4th in the fall, and had worked evenings and Saturdays, and had deposited everything above his base expenses into a separate account that had no connection to any prior part of his life. He had incorporated Voss Capital Group in Delaware after 14 months of accumulation, seeding it with what he had saved, and with a credit facility that his credit history and his project record had made available at terms that rewarded the patience he had been practicing. He had then spent the following 2 years placing the capital in positions that Walter, not Walter Briggs, but a different Walter, a private equity advisor named Walter Gaines, whom he had met at an engineering conference and whose analytical rigor he had recognized immediately as compatible with his own, had identified as undervalued relative to their structural potential. He had not thought of it in those years as building toward anything specific. He had thought of it as building correctly. The direction would become clear from the work, the way directions always did for a man who trusted the process more than the destination. He did not think about Camille often. He thought about the work. 3 years after the divorce was final, a former colleague named Devin, who still worked in the Nashville engineering circuit and who had a reliable sense of the commercial landscape, mentioned over lunch that Meridian Systems was producing exceptional output on paper and hemorrhaging margin in practice, that the founder was brilliant at the product side and resistant to the operational restructuring that the product side required, and that there was money to be made if someone with the right profile came in at the right angle. Devin had said this as a professional observation. He had not known the name of Meridian's founder. Theodore had not told him. Theodore had gone home and pulled up Meridian's public filings and the industry coverage and the client reviews and the technical documentation, and he had spent 6 weeks doing what he did with every problem, reading it from every angle until the structure beneath the surface became clear. The structure was what he had expected. The product was genuinely good. The operations were genuinely broken. The fix was not complicated if you understood both what needed to stay and what needed to change. He had then spent 14 months becoming the firm's largest outside customer and the most informed potential acquirer in the region, and he had done it without Camille knowing who he was, and he had kept the process clean and documented and entirely above board because he was an engineer, and engineers did not cut corners even when no one was watching. He had called his attorney, a woman named Josephine Carr, who had done his business work for 3 years, and who operated with the particular focused intelligence of someone who had seen every variety of complicated and had never been surprised by it. And he had put the acquisition proposal in front of her in January. Josephine had reviewed it over 10 days and had called him back with 3 questions and then said, "This is clean. The only unusual element is the prior relationship between you and the owner. That creates disclosure obligations we need to handle carefully." He had said he understood. She had said, "You understand that the acquisition proceeding will reveal your identity to her before closing." He had said he was aware of that. She had said, "And you are comfortable with that timing." He had said, "I think the timing is correct." Josephine had been quiet for a moment. She said, "I want to be clear that we are not structuring this to cause harm. We are structuring it to acquire a business that you have legitimate grounds to acquire at fair market value." He said, "I know. That is what we are doing." She said, "Then I don't have any other concerns." Over the following 6 weeks, Josephine assembled the acquisition package with the methodical thoroughness that Theodore had come to rely on entirely. The financing documentation, the Voss Capital Group corporate structure, the independent valuation that confirmed fair market value, and the operational analysis he had commissioned from a consultant he trusted. That last document had been his idea, and Josephine had raised an eyebrow at it. She said, "It's not a standard closing document." He said, "No." She said, "What is it for?" He said, "It's for her to understand what she had and what she missed." Josephine had looked at him for a moment in the way she looked at things that were not legally problematic, but that were humanly precise. She had said, "All right. I'll include it in the closing package." She had not asked anything further. The weeks between submission of the offer and signature had been the longest of the process. Theodore had gone to work every day and come home every evening and worked at the reclaimed oak desk until 10, and gone to bed and risen at 5:30 and done it again. and he had not spoken to anyone about what was in motion. Devon had mentioned Meridian again at lunch in March, wondering aloud if the acquisition rumor he had heard was true. And Theodore had said he was not in a position to comment on market activity, which was a sentence Josephine had suggested, and which Devon had accepted with the good grace of someone who understood that some conversations had walls around them. The offer had gone in at fair market value, fully documented, with a financing package that Meridian's board, which consisted of Camille and 2 outside advisors, could not reasonably decline given the firm's current operational pressure. The advisors had recommended acceptance unanimously. Camille had accepted on a Friday afternoon, signing the terms without yet knowing who she was signing them to, because the acquiring entity was Voss Capital Group, and the name Voss had not yet connected itself to anything in her mind. The identity of the principal behind Voss Capital Group had been disclosed to Camille Ashby, as she now styled herself, on the Monday following signature, in a formal closing communication from Josephine's office that listed Theodore Raymond Voss as the controlling member. She had received it at 9:17 in the morning. The main office line had logged its first call from her personal number at 9:22. Real Power operated in quiet rooms, and had been operating there, in silence, for 4 years. The closing meeting was held on a Wednesday in Josephine's conference room on the 14th floor of a building downtown, with a view of the Cumberland River, that Theodore had always thought was wasted on a law office and had never mentioned. Camille arrived with her own attorney, a man named Preston Greaves, who had the prepared confidence of someone who had been told the meeting was a formality and had dressed accordingly. It was not a formality. Josephine had arranged the room in the way she arranged all significant proceedings, documents in order, principals in their correct positions, the architecture of the space conveying without announcement that everything here had been anticipated. Theodore arrived 8 minutes early and was reading through the transition summary when Camille came in. She stopped for a moment when she saw him. Just a moment. Then she composed herself and sat down and did not look at him directly, which was its own form of acknowledgement. She looked older than he had last seen her, not badly so, but in the specific way of someone who had been carrying something that had weight. She had dressed carefully for a room she had expected to walk through easily and had found instead to be a different room entirely. Her attorney whispered something to her, and she nodded and looked at the table. Preston Greaves cleared his throat and said there were a number of terms his client wished to revisit. Josephine said, "The terms were accepted in writing on Friday. We are here to close, not to renegotiate." He said, "My client was not fully aware," Josephine said. "Your client signed a standard acquisition agreement at fair market value, with full disclosure of all material terms. The identity of the acquiring principal was disclosed in accordance with the agreed timeline. There is nothing here that was not known before signature or disclosed according to the terms of the letter of intent." She placed the closing package on the table. The closing package contained the acquisition agreement, the financing documentation, the operational transition plan, and the independent operational analysis. Josephine set each section out in order, one beside the other, without ceremony. Theodore watched Camille's eyes move to the analysis last and stay there. The analysis was 41 pages. It identified 17 distinct operational inefficiencies, each one quantified, each one mapped to a specific process failure, each one accompanied by a recovery projection and a recommended intervention. Theodore had read it 3 times. He knew it the way he knew the load-bearing diagram of a structure, completely, in 3 dimensions, from every angle. He had also known, from the 14 months of operational visibility that his customer relationship had provided, that every finding in the report was something Camille's team had flagged internally and had not been able to get traction on. which meant the problems were not invisible to her people. They had been invisible only to the decision that needed to move. He placed his copy on the table in front of him. He did not say anything. He let the documents speak. Camille looked at the analysis for a long time. Something moved through her expression that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition, but was in the territory between them. The place where a person realizes that what they were looking at had been there all along, and they had simply not seen it. Her attorney said something about procedural concerns that Josephine addressed in 2 sentences. Then, there was quiet. Theodore said, in the measured voice of a man who had been holding a sentence for 6 years and had decided that this was its correct moment, "I'm not here because of what you said. I'm here because of what I built after you said it. Those are different things, and I want you to understand that." Camille looked at him for the first time since she had sat down. He said, "I'm going to fix the operations. The product is good. I'll keep the team. The company will do well." He paused. "I thought you should know that." He did not say anything else. He signed the closing documents. He stood. He shook Josephine's hand. He walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby and wrote it down alone and walked out into the October afternoon. He did not look back. He did not check his phone until he reached the truck. The 67th missed call had come in the previous morning. There had not been a 68th. 14 months later, Theodore Voss stood in the operations center of what had been Meridian Systems and was now called Voss Meridian in the company filings, and simply Meridian to the people who worked there. And he looked at the throughput dashboard on the wall and saw numbers that reflected exactly what the independent consultant's analysis had projected, and that had been invisible to everyone who had been too close to the product to see the process. The operational restructuring had taken 7 months. He had done most of it himself, alongside a director of operations he had hired from a freight logistics company in Memphis, a woman named Camille. A different Camille, a coincidence he had noted once and never mentioned, who had the rare and specific capability of being able to translate between engineering logic and human workflow without losing either side of the translation. The margins had recovered to 22% in the second quarter. The product roadmap had been extended by 2 full cycles. 3 of the original employees who had been on the verge of leaving had stayed. The house on Caldwell Street had been fully renovated. The reclaimed oak desk was still in the spare bedroom, still level, the steel legs still true. He had added a workshop in the garage where he kept the tools his father had left him, organized on a pegboard the way Lawrence Voss had always kept his own. Every tool returned to its outline at the end of every session. A woman named Renee, whom he had met at an engineering industry event in the spring, had asked him what the most important thing he had ever built was. And he had said the question had 2 answers, and they were not the same thing. She had said she wanted both. He had said that someday he would tell her. She had said she could wait. She was a structural engineer with a practice of her own and the particular directness of someone who did not ask questions she was not prepared to hear answered, and she was present in his life in a way that felt like the right kind of permanent. Camille Ashby had taken a consulting role at a marketing firm in Atlanta in the spring, having accepted the acquisition terms, and departed Nashville within 2 months of closing. Someone had run into her at an industry function and mentioned it to a mutual contact, who had mentioned it to Theodore, who had listened and registered it and turned back to the dashboard. She had built a good product. That was real, and that was hers, and he had never once questioned it, not even sitting across a closing table from her in October. Not once. She had been wrong about one other thing. That was real too. He was free. He was solvent. He was unbothered, and the 67 missed calls sat in a call log he had never deleted, not out of bitterness, but because his father had told him that the most important measurement was the first one, and sometimes the first measurement was the distance between what someone told you that you were and what you went out and became. The index card was still in the notebook. He had looked at it once in 6 years, on the morning the acquisition closed, and then he had closed the notebook and put it back on the shelf, because that was where it belonged now, filed, documented, complete, not carried, not forgotten. Simply finished, the way all true things were eventually finished, not by being undone, but by being superseded by the weight of everything built after them. He had measured correctly. Everything that followed had been built on that. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.